Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is include. Let's take a moment and review some of the definitions or the ways that we use this verb. The first way you might hear or see include used means to comprise or contain as part of a whole. When I think of this first definition, something that immediately comes to mind, because you hear it in commercials and you might even see it, sometimes as things are being sold, you might hear this includes tax. So it would mean tax is contained as part of the amount you're being told, is the price for something. A second way you might hear include used can mean to make part of a whole or a set. Okay? And then a third way include gets used can mean to allow someone to share in an activity or a privilege, right? So you might think of this as like inviting someone to be part of something. For now, you should know that include is a regular verb. To make the progressive form of this verb, you're going to drop the E before adding ing, and that's because our verb ends in the pattern vowel consonant E. To make the past tense and participle forms of this verb, all we need to do is add D since this verb already ends in an E. Now our base verb ends with the letter E, but it ends with a D sound, right? When I say that verb, include, right? D should be the last sound you hear. This means when we add an ED ending, we're going to add an extra syllable to this verb. So when I say the past tense or participle forms of the verb, it should sound like this. Included, included, okay? Now let's move on and talk about a couple phrasal verbs that you might encounter. The first that you might hear is to include among. That can mean to consider someone or something as part of a particular group or as part of a particular category. An example of this might be, I include her among my closest friends. Right? So my closest friends is the particular group, right? And I'm saying someone is in, or I'm considering them to be in this particular group. Another phrasal verb you might encounter is to include in. This means you are involving or incorporating someone in something. An example of this. Did you include them in the dinner invitation? Right? So we're kind of asking, did you invite them? Now, let's continue using our verb of the day. Today, we're going to focus on making sentences in the simple future. And there are several ways that we can talk about the future. Today, we're going to compare some sentences using will and other sentences using be going to. Let's start by talking about will. Will is most common when people are making predictions about what they think will happen in the future. It's also used as people make promises or offers. It's a little less common to hear it with plans, but it still happens a bit. The nice thing about making sentences in the simple future is that our structure stays the same no matter what our subject is. So in the affirmative, we always start with a subject, we use will, and then the base verb. An example of this might be, I will include you in all future meetings. Maybe one coworker is saying this to another, and they're saying this as a promise, right? They might be saying it after this person was left out, right? So kind of like, I promise, going forward into the future, I will include you. If I want to make a negative sentence in the simple future using will, again, I start with my subject, I use will not, and then the base verb. Something that gets a little confusing for students I know is when we combine will not into the contraction, it changes the spelling to won't, W-O-N''T. And that word won't has a long O sound to it. Sometimes students tell me that word sounds very close, if not the same to them, as W-A-N-T or W-E-N-T, but all three of those words should have different sounds. So let's take a look now at a negative simple future sentence with will. Next year's budget won't include any wage cuts. Again, this might be another promise a leader is making. This could be a CEO, maybe it's a mayor or other political leader, right? Kind of promising, right? I'm not going to reduce wages or the money people are paid for a particular job. Now let's talk about making a yes or no question in the simple future. To do this, you start with will, then you're going to have your subject, and then the base verb. Here's my last example with will. Will the estimated cost include all taxes and fees? Right? I know this is something that can be really frustrating when people purchase things or they look for prices online. I know this happens a lot in travel. You see the price of a flight or the price of a hotel, you think, oh, that's great. And then by the time you get through the process of booking it, the price is actually much higher because there are taxes and fees that get added on. So here, someone wants to know, has that already been added in? Now let's talk a little more about making sentences another way in the simple future, and that's with be going to. When we make sentences with be going to, people frequently are discussing their plans. And these frequently are things they're pretty confident are going to happen in the future. It's a little less common to hear people use be going to make a promise or make a prediction. And the thing that sometimes makes this a little trickier than using will is that our form of be is going to change. That's because we will be using a present form of be. And be has three forms in the present. So if your subject is I, you're going to use am, going to, and then the base verb. No special endings on the end of the verb. But if your subject is you, we, or they, you'll use are, A-R-E, going to, and then the base verb. Finally, if your subject is he, she, or it, use is, going to, and the base verb. Let's take a look at an example. The new exhibit is going to include a wide variety of objects on display across 2 floors and outdoors too. Okay. So here maybe we're discussing a museum's plans, right? They've probably already designed these things. They've made plans, they've purchased the items, maybe they've already started putting them in specific spots, right? So we have pretty set plans here. Okay. New exhibit is one thing. That's like an it. That's why you see is in that particular sentence. Now let's talk about making negative sentences in the simple future. Again, we have to pay attention to our subject. We're going to use the form of be, so am, is, or are, whichever form matches that subject next. Then we use not, going to, and the base verb. You can combine are not into the contraction aren't. You can combine the words is not into the contraction isn't, but we do not have a contraction for am not. So that always stays separate. Let's take a look at an example sentence here. Our alternatives to using earplugs at night aren't going to include putting pillows against your ears. I saw a sentence very similar to this as someone was talking about offering solutions or suggestions to ways people can improve their sleep. So one of their suggestions had to do with having really quiet environments, and here they're sort of explaining what's coming next in this article, but their plan was not just to take pillows against your ears. Finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the simple future with be going to. To do this, you're going to start with your present form of be, whichever form matches the subject. That subject comes next. Then use going to and the base verb. Here's my last example. Are you going to include those details in your memo, right? Are you going to make it part of the whole thing? Okay. Now let's move on and talk about some words that are related to our verb include. The first word we're going to talk about today is the noun inclusion. This is the act of including someone or something as part of a group, a list, etc. Right? Something similar. Let's take a look at an example of this noun in a sentence. The inclusion of Negro League statistics in Major League Baseball records enhances baseball's history. So this is something that has been in the news in the last month here in the United States. So up until the late 1940s in the United States, Black people were not permitted to play in the sort of highest professional baseball league, right? So they had their kind of own separate baseball league called the Negro League. And up until very, very recently, right, those statistics and who had the most hits, the most stolen bases, the most home runs, and so on and so forth, right, those things were kept separate. But now they have brought them together, right? So these Negro League statistics are being included in Major League Baseball's records, right? Kind of the top performers over the history of this sport. Another related word you might encounter is the adjective includable. This means allowed or able to be included as part of a total or as part of a group. So an example of this. Is this includable when calculating income? Sometimes you hear people ask this question as they're calculating their taxes or calculating their total income to determine if they're eligible for some particular program, right? And so we want to know, is it allowed to add this in? Another related word you might encounter is the adjective inclusive. This adjective can have a number of different meanings. We're going to talk about 3 of them today. The first way to use the adjective inclusive means including or covering all of the services, all of the facilities, all of the items that are normally expected or required. So again, I'm going to go back to my example of prices. Are prices inclusive of taxes, right? We want to know, have the taxes been added in? Is it covering everything? A second way to use the adjective inclusive means not excluding any of the parties or groups involved in something. An example of this might be, we need an inclusive peace process to solve this conflict. Right? So through the course of history, there have been different times, different wars, different conflicts, where one group or maybe several groups are not included. They are not part of figuring out, how do we solve this? How do we create a more peaceful environment? So this sentence is saying, right, we can't exclude anyone from finding a peaceful resolution to this problem. A third way to use the adjective inclusive means aiming to provide equal access to opportunities and resources for people who may have previously been excluded. So this third meaning of the adjective inclusive has been used a lot over, I would say, the last maybe 3 to 5 years, as we have become more aware, as there's greater conversation about people who have been marginalized throughout history. So an example of how you might hear this adjective used now, we strive to have an inclusive classroom environment. This really means we don't want people to feel like they're not in or they're not part of it. These could be people who have different abilities. Maybe there are physical limitations. So we need to make some changes so that everyone can access the things they need to be involved in the learning process. But it could be many different ways to make sure that we have those equal access or equal opportunities for individuals. Thanks again for watching today's video. I hope you have a great day.